name is Gail Beal, and I'm a volunteer at the VA Eastern Kansas Health Care Center at the Colmery-O'Neil VA Medical Center in Topeka, Kansas. Today is October 3rd, 2003. As part of the Veterans History Project, I will be interviewing Dr. Phillip L. Baker. Dr. Baker lives at 3133 Southwest 15th Street in Topeka. His date of birth is February 16, 1937. Dr. Baker served in the U.S. Army from July 1, 1964 through June 15, 1966, and served during the Vietnam War in Germany. Dr. Baker attained the rank of captain. Also present in the room with us today is Wilbur Doyle, the cameraman. Dr. Baker, we want to hear about your life.
I grew up in Iowa. My parents were married during the Depression and were products of that stressful time, I guess one would say. Shortly after their marriage in 1935, they moved to Gold Hill, Oregon, and worked in the fields, picking fruit and vegetables. Lots of hops my mother used to talk about, but she disliked because of all the vermin that crawled on them in the days before our treatment of products so that we don't have so many insects on them. And I was born out there in 1937, and they had been there now about a year plus, and 3 months after my birth they returned to Iowa. So for me, I really grew up in Vale, Iowa, in Crawford County, west central Iowa. Actually, Vale's on Highway 30, or what we know as the Lincoln Highway in those days, and was a major east-west route from one coast to the other, passing through Chicago and on west. It's been bypassed, of course, by the interstates at this point. Anyway, I grew up in Vale, went to school there. One school building. You started in the lower room on the first floor and went through classes of usually 3 grades per class, kind of like an advanced form of a grade school in the country. So you usually had the same teacher for several years. You knew everyone. There were no real secrets in the school because there weren't very many people. At one stretch in my time, I remember from the 4th through the 8th grade, I had the same teacher. So I had one teacher giving me all my information for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She was a single lady, a very strict disciplinarian. But we did a lot of reading and writing and arithmetic, I guess, was the way things were taught in those days. Even penmanship, which I lost as I've become a physician, but that's a separate story. And the good of that, I remember when she quit teaching, and I've kind of forgotten that year, but it was sometime when I was in high school, so that would have to be about 51 to 55. She retired and gave me her textbook of literature, which I to this day still have. I thought that was kind of a touching thing. She called me down to her home and gave me this book because she knew I liked to read, and that's what was her gift to me. We had one library in the high school. It covered one wall. It probably had about 15 shelves of books and was about 50 feet long. And that's all the library or reading material we had in that school. Starting in the grades, I was given permission to go up there and get books out of the library and read them because that was one of my passions, and I was fortunate enough to be given the ability to kind of keep up with my work, and therefore I had a chance to do that, and that was a lot of fun. I always tell people in the high school, I graduated from high school in 1955 in Vail Public School. That particular year, for many years, my father had been president of the school board. In the year I received my diploma, it was given to me by my father, which I thought was kind of neat because he was the president of the school board at the time. But anyway, when I graduated from high school, there were 34 students in the high school. Now that's 4 grades, from the 9th through the 12th, and the 34 of us, with 9 of us in my grade. And even though I was valedictorian in my class, you can see that there were only 8 behind me, so the lowest we could be is 8th in the class, behind the valedictorian. One of the stories I tell people is the only way you could tell the difference between the junior class play and the senior class play in my high school was the time of year, because the juniors put theirs on in the fall and the seniors was in the spring. And who got the money? Because the people that were in the plays had to be the same. There were only a certain number in our high school that could memorize that many lines, and so it was the same people in all the plays. And I was in 2 plays every year for 4 years, so I guess my acting career was a total of 8 plays, and that ended it. After graduating from high school, then I went on to Iowa State University. My remembrances before, as I'm growing up in Vail, is it's a small town. I delivered newspapers for years. The Des Moines Register was the primary one that came to our area, and I was the local delivery boy for years and years. So I knew all the people, and they knew me. It wasn't like it is now, where you just drive by and throw the paper on the front yard and drive by and move on. In those days, everyone had a place they wanted their paper. It might be a box, it might be under the front mat, it might be inside the screen door. And one lady who was quite crippled with arthritis that I knew very well wanted me to bring it right to her. So I would take the paper, I would open her door, walk clear through the house, and she would be in a bay window watching for me to come with the paper, and I would hand her the paper and walk back out. So it was service to wherever. And that was how papers were delivered. Of course, we all knew each other. They knew me, and I knew them. That's good, because you have a real expanded community to care for you. The bad is you didn't dare do anything, because the word got back before you could even think about it. Everybody in the county knew my car when I was in high school, and so my dad would know by the next nightfall what town I'd been into the night before if I were out. Because someone he'd run into would say, well, I saw Phil with his friends in the next town, or playing softball, or what have you. So you really had eyes and ears everywhere watching. Played a lot of sports. I finished with 12 letters, athletic letters from my high school, and again, that's a little tiny school. We had no football, so you could only run track, baseball, or play basketball. I did a lot of sports, and had my senior year, I was fortunate enough to win about a week after my graduation. I won 3 gold medals at the district track meet in Boone, Iowa, and went on to state and won 1 there that year. So I was fortunate. Learning came easily, and I think that was, I always tell people, I think there's a true gift in life. If you are gifted with intellectual ability, and you're gifted as an athlete to a certain degree, just enough that you compete, you have really been given a great start in almost any school or any system, because for some reason we really like our athletes, and if they happen to be intellectually okay, they have a true gift given to them that I really think they all should use. I like all to use those things, but those are, you've got such a start in life that you should never muff it up. Went on to Iowa State, and I graduated there in 1959. I was with a Bachelor of Science in Zoology. I minored in chemistry and physics. Belonged to a fraternity, Acacia fraternity, which is a spin-off of the Masonic organization. Joined it mainly because it emphasized grades. I wanted some kind of social contact, but the real thing was grades, and we always had the top grades at Iowa State for the fraternities all the years I was there, except maybe every now and then we might slip to second, but very rarely, so we really emphasized that.
Had you initially intended to become a veterinarian since you had majored in zoology?
No. Actually, I was going back to the farm. I really liked the farm. I liked the farming life, and so I went to Iowa State and signed up for pre-med. My mother really wanted me to take a shot at it. My mother was a nurse. She graduated from the University of Nebraska with a degree in nursing, and really wanted me to take a shot at it. Now, I came from a small school. I had no chemistry in high school, for example. I had a touch of physics. It was the coach. And in those days, there was some kind of like a crossword puzzle in the newspapers that came out, and everybody worked them, and you sent them in trying to win a contest. And I've forgotten the name of that, but it came out every Monday in the Des Moines Register. So the physics class would get the coach talking about this contest, and we would spend as much time as we could getting him to help us with this. Of course, that kept us away from the physics. Then we would talk about the basketball games, because we had one on Tuesday and one on Friday, and that took care of a couple more days. And so basically I learned no physics. I did very well in high school in physics, but I learned no physics. But anyway, I went with the idea I was going into agriculture. And so I started in pre-med. My mother had made arrangements for me to travel and follow a physician for several days. He was a family practitioner in Denison, Iowa, by the name of Dr. Crabb, spelled with 2 B's, and a delightful man, very, very good. And I followed there, and that gave me an interest. But I went to Iowa State, and there's no pre-med program. They just tell you what courses you need, and we were signed up to, if you took chemistry, you were with the chemistry majors. When I took my physics to get my advanced physics that I needed, I was with the physics majors, and etc. So the competition in these various areas was fairly keen. I remember when I hit my physics in my sophomore year, the professor did not like pre-meds, and he didn't let that be unknown. He told everybody, and he pulled us all out and put us in a class together. That's the way it was set up. And then he curved the class. Well, you knew somebody was not going to make it. If you have an absolute curve, somebody's going out. It doesn't make any difference how good these people are. And that's the way he kind of functioned. He taught all on theory, nothing out of the book. And I remember I'll remember this forever. My first physics exam, I had 50 points out of 100. My second physics exam, I had 17. I was losing ground. So I'm going to the final with a total of rip-roaring 67 out of 200 points, and I'm in a world of hurt. Well, by that time I decided I better do something different than what he was doing. So I went back to this book, and I started from the beginning, and every night I worked every problem in the book. I memorized every formula, and I knew how the formulas worked. I don't know that I knew physics at that time very well, but I knew how the book worked. And I did that until I did all the questions, and I would do the ones of the night before, the next night. And I did that for 2 weeks, and I just really went at it. I went to the final, and I knew by this time that I had a way how to figure out how he made up questions. So I had this pretty well in mind, that I was going to do okay. And I went to this big chemistry lab, and I sat in the front row, right in front of him, because I knew that I was going to get a good score. And he surely accused me of cheating, because I had been in to see him, and I said, I need to do something. You know, I've never been this low on a score in any time in my whole life. You know, I've come from a high school that when I graduated I had 1B out of the whole high school, and that was in home economics. That's the only B I got one semester. So I had not been exposed to this idea of you can't do. He told me, he said, Mr. Baker, he said, you might as well go back to the farm because you're never going to make it to medicine. And I'll never forget that. So that gave me a lot of drive, and I took this exam, and I got everything right. That man gave me a C. And I figured probably that's about what I deserved because I didn't do very well to begin with. But we were under quarter systems, and I had him then for 2 more quarters after that. And that's the way I did everything from then on. I just ignored kind of what he said, went to the book, and learned. And I don't think I had a score below 90 in the next 2 quarters. And I got 2 more C's. I always felt that he just wasn't really fair, but that's the way it was. Anyway, I graduated from Iowa State, and then I interned at Menorah Medical Center in Kansas City, Missouri. Spent a year there. At that time, I was going to be an internist, and so I chose that hospital because it had an outstanding internal medical staff, and that's what I thought I was going to be as an internist. And when I arrived, I was one of the interns that had a lot of exposure to emergency room work because in Nebraska we had to rotate through the county hospital. So I had a lot of exposure and a lot more than the rest of my friends. So that's where they started me in July of 1963. Well, the first person you meet in the emergency room in the summer is an orthopedist because everybody's doing things to our parts as we're out of doors and having good times. I met an orthopedist who was just new to the staff, and he didn't have much to do. So we talked a lot, and I became interested in orthopedics and worked with him a lot during that year, and that's what switched me from internal medicine to orthopedics. And during that year, I was fortunate enough to be voted the outstanding intern of the staff, and I had the best research paper of the staff at that particular year. And then came a transition in my life that led to my military because this is now 1964. We are beginning in our country. We had been in Vietnam for some time, but only in an advisory role as we became aware of later on. I wanted to then become an orthopedist, so I applied at the University of Kansas. That's where I wanted to go. And they had already picked the 2 residents that would fit the year that I would be coming in. So there was no opening. Now I had to make a decision. Do I take an extra year of general surgery and then apply for the following year, which would have been okay. But now the war enters, or the precursors. Now, a little background leading to that. My father had been on the Selective Service Board in Crawford County, Iowa, for one day less than forever. I think at least 20 years. At the time this was going on, he was the chairman of the board, or the leader, whatever they did to run the meetings. So if I was an ordinary person at that point in my career, I think I'd have missed the military forever. I just don't think probably there would have been some way I'd have probably missed the draft. But now I'm a doctor, and I'm on a separate list, and they're kept at the state level, and they had calls for doctors on a kind of a regular basis. And my dad said, I'll tell you, you live in Kansas. And Iowa's going to pick all those that are on their list that are elsewhere because that doesn't ruffle the hometown. So he said, I just think you're going to be called. I just think you will. Now, that wasn't a sure thing, but that's what we were told. And I said, well, with that in mind, I better sign up because I have a year to stall anyway, and I might as well just go to the Army. I'd go to the military. Now, I don't think I gave a great deal of thought other than most of the people I knew had been in the Army in my small hometown. We had a few in the other services, but most were Army. So I just went down to the Army recruiting station in Kansas City that at that time was down about right near what we now know of as the Union Station and the Hyatt complex in the Crown Center. maybe it's still there, I don't know, but there was a building that's right in that area, right on, and that's where I went and signed up. Of course, that kind of stunned them to a certain degree because they didn't get very many physicians that walked through the door and signed up to go to the Army. I put down I wanted to go to Germany. You know, they asked you where you wanted to go, and that time I didn't know that what you wrote down and what happened may not necessarily be two in the same, but I signed up. I'd like to go to Germany.
And why did you pick Germany?
I'd never been anywhere besides the United States. My parents did do a lot of, we vacationed a lot when I was a youth, 1 week a year, drive as hard as you could, back. That was your vacation. But I thought I'd go overseas. And I had German in college because I had to have that for my requirements for medical school. So I did have a little knowledge of that language, and I thought, well, let's take a shot at it. Anyway, I went down and had my physical along with, we went in with everybody, all the doctors, and there were a few of us there, and took a physical. And I was in good shape, so there was no problem with that. And the next thing, I received orders to be sent to Germany, to Aschaffenburg, which is a city just a little bit south of Frankfurt, Germany, kind of in the upper end of Bavaria. So I remember calling my wife. At this time now, I'm married. Backtrack a little bit here, and I'll bring that part of the story up. I met my wife in 1960. I was a freshman in medical school, and I was taking the county paper, and I get the county paper regularly, and it came and I'm working on a research project at that time for the Public Health Department, doing iron research or iron metabolism research in pregnant women. That was in the days we didn't know much about that, and that really led to my thesis in medical school. But I was doing that and got paid a little bit of money. During that time, I got the county paper came from the Denison Bulletin and Review from Denison, Iowa, Crawford County. Anyway, it came, and they had all the pictures of the new teachers in the school. And my dad, being president of the school board at that time, said, well, they'd had two teachers coming. And one of those was a pretty nice, well, both of them were very nice-looking young ladies. So I heard about them from my father, and I saw a picture in the paper of my wife. So I came home for a week break before I was going back to medical school, or 10 days of break. And I just called her one morning. I knew where she lived, and it's only a few miles away, so I called her and talked to her on the phone, and I talked her into a coffee date. Gave her this big pitch, of course, that I'm in medical school, and my dad's on the school board, and all these things that I thought would probably give me a line, if you say nowadays, it'd be a line. Got all through with this talk, and she said she'd go. It was in the afternoon, so it'd be broad daylight, for both of us. Wouldn't have too much trouble. And anyway, I finished my pitch, and she answered on the phone. She said, now, what did you say your name was? And we laugh about that to this day, because she was going to get that name down well and go to the high school, because everybody knows everybody up there. This is small town country. And she went right to the principal, and he knew me because actually he had worked on a construction crew that I worked on during the summers for money until this summer that I was in medical school. I'd worked there many summers. So he knew me well. He said I was okay. So anyway, we met and dated that whole year, and then were married the following August. So really it was about 1 year, and we were married, and then she moved to Omaha and taught in Omaha. And that brings us up to, she's now, as we moved from Omaha, where I was in medical school at the University of Nebraska, then we moved to Kansas City, and she taught there in the Shawnee Mission school systems. She taught at Meadowbrook Junior High, which is what in those days fed into Shawnee Mission East. And I called her at school and said, I have this order for Aschaffenburg. So she went to the map because we had no idea where we were going. So she went over to the school maps to see if she could find where Schaffensburg was, or as the military knew it in those days, Aberg. That was just called Aberg. I'm stationed in Aberg. Well, we found it. It's a pretty good sized city. It's on, I believe it's on the Main River, just south of Frankfurt, and there was a large military contingent there. Well, we no more than kind of figured out where this was, and I had a new set of orders. And now I'm assigned to Kitzingen, K-I-T-Z-I-N-G-E-N, Kitzingen, Germany. Well, Kitzingen's lit 20,000 people, and the maps in this part of the country, nowadays with the fancy maps we have at Barnes & Noble and those places, you can find it easily. But in those days, there weren't big maps of Germany, and we couldn't find it. We had no idea where we were going, except I had been assigned to the 1st Battalion of the 15th Infantry. I was given a contact name of the doctor who was there at the time, and I was corresponding with this man. I think we had about 2 letters back and forth. But he never told the command people of the unit that he was talking with the doctor. I assume he must have thought they knew. But anyway, they didn't. So at the end of my graduated from medical school, and my internship, and we went from the internship, and I had my orders to go on July 1st of 1964. I was sent to, along with the doctors and the dentists and the veterinarians and the medical service corps officers, and we arrived at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, for 1 month to indoctrinate us and give us our uniforms and all the various things one needs for the military. And we spent a month there. It was a relatively warm month because there was barracks and no air conditioning in those days. San Antonio in July is above average heat for an Iowan anyway. And anyway, then I came back home for about 10 days, and they shipped me out. We'd had a real family crisis by this time because in June, just before I went into the service, my wife's mother died. She was about 56 and died suddenly. And so we had a tremendous strain in our family. We didn't have any children, but my wife and I and her family, and she was extremely close to her mother, and they were just almost clones, and that was really a hard time. So Betty stayed behind, and I went overseas. Went to, think how we did that. I think we went to New Jersey and flew out of Fort Dix. And again, on one of those military transport planes, and anybody that's flown them in the military knows exactly what they are. You fly backwards with all the plumbing exposed in this plane with 2 little windows, one out each door. And we flew to Europe. It was okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Went there in a jet, that was good. Landed in Frankfurt, and one of the fellows I had met by this time who was going over there at the same time was going to a unit in the very same city that I was in. And he had been talking with his people, and they had given him a number to call when he landed. So he called his unit, which was the 1st to 64th Armor, and told him he was in Frankfurt. And we were going then by train from the airport to Kitzingen, about 100 miles. Not quite. I said, well, why don't you just call my unit and just tell them I'm here too, and so I just assumed they probably knew. They had no clue. They had no clue that I was coming. Well, by the time I got there, however, they had mustered, and the train arrived and crossed the town from where the concern was, or where we were stationed, and the adjutant showed up and met the train and took me over the unit to sign in. Had no housing. I was going to stay in the BOQs. So I signed in, and I went over to this one room and stayed there. And next door to me, they came in the day before, was a man who was in charge of the local Red Cross. I've forgotten his name, but he just arrived, and he was living there waiting for his family and places to stay. I was not eligible for housing because I was a 2-year man, so I had to get some kind of housing for us on the economy, as it was known in those days. The next morning we went up and signed into the division headquarters, and that processed me, and we did all that. And I said, well, we had been corresponding, my wife and I, with the school there by this time to see if we could get her a job. They know how, the school knows how the military works. They don't want to really talk with you too much until they see the whites of your eyes, because as we already knew, we had 2 assignments before we ever got there. But once I got there, I walked in, and we were trying to, she was a home economics teacher, and they really needed one. But anyway, I walked into that school, and I'm trying to see if I can get a job for my wife. This is after I signed in. The school's on the military post. Walked in, and of course, once you have all your uniform on, everybody knows who you are in the military. You know, you look up in the corner, you can see their rank, you can see their unit, you know their name, you know a whole lot about this person. That you even know what they earn because you know what their rank is, and they can't be too far from that. The military really has a nice system of quickly identifying everybody. He recognized who I was and said, well, is your wife here? I said, no, she's still in the States. I just got here. He said, well, if she can be here in 5 days, she's got a job. And we really haven't talked at all. Well, now, I'm in Germany. My wife's in northwest Missouri, living with her dad, her mother had just died. And she's to be there in 5 days. I don't think they hadn't been that fast, but that's what they told me, and I believed everything I was said and told in those days. And then I had to get hold of her, and I wasn't too sure how to do that. So I went back to this Red Cross fellow, and I said, my plight, he said, well, we'll just send her a telegram. Well, of course, little did I know that's how that whole system works. So you go there, we went down, we wrote out a nice long letter of all the various things that are going on. He sent it through his system. It went back to Kansas City. It was then transferred to Bethany, Missouri, which is the county seat near where she lived. And it was hand-delivered about 15 miles north of there where she lived by someone who knew her and read her this story. And the next thing I know, I got another telegram back in a day or two from her back through the same system saying she'd be on flight such and such arriving in Frankfurt, which she did. And that brought her there, and she taught then. Betty, my wife Betty, her name's Betty Ruth White before we were married. And she taught them the entire 2 years we were there, which made it nice for us because she had something to do and paid, of course, for it. And then we spent 2 years in the Army. And so that brings me to Germany and the start of my military career. The next day I went, this is the 3rd day I'm in Europe. It's now time to go meet my commanding officers and all that, and I put on my fatigues, and I thought I was about as put together as you could get. There's, all these things have a fair number of buttons. And I went up and met the colonel, Frank Phelps Jones, Colonel Jones. He was a lieutenant colonel at that time, became colonel while I was there. An amazing man. But anyway, he looked at me after I saluted him and said hello, and he was making me feel at home. There was one button unbuttoned. And he went over and buttoned that, and he said, this is not too bad for a doctor. And I knew we were going to get off, we were going to get a good start. That was okay. Not too bad for a doctor. So anyway, he then, somehow they gave me a top secret clearance. I have no idea how I got that. They just did. And so that allowed me to go all the command briefings, in which I went every day. I went there just like the line officers did, and everyone as they had their morning whatever. And then I would go from there to the dispensary to do sick call. And I took care of the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry soldiers. There were 1,000 plus of those and their officers. And then during the daytime after that, I moved down to the dispensary, because on this post was the dispensary for the whole area, for anyone, all the civilians, children. After hours, we took call there, and that's where we did all dispensary on the second floor initially of this old German barrack on this post, the base. This was a airfield. We had a long airfield there. In fact, we had an aviation battalion stationed there. This airfield, excuse me, could be flooded during the war, and so we did not know that. We, as the military, did not know this was an airfield until right at the end of the war, because they flooded it every night, early in the morning, and only flew out of it at night. So when they went over in the morning, this is a lake, and when they filmed it, and they didn't know that for a long time, so the airfield was in quite good shape. And we had the aviation battalion there. But anyway, so these are the barracks that go with this military base. It was German, and they were built in the 30s, 20s. I was on the second floor, old wooden boards with big cracks between them, and that's where we ran the aid station. It was really pretty primitive. I told the colonel that. I said that, I suggested to him that this wasn't the world's best to take care of our people, so they found me a room down at the dispensary, and so most of the time I just went to the dispensary like the rest of the, I worked out of a fairly nice facility, very nice, and took care of the people. What I remember about the unit, we were beginning to get some of the officers back in and NCOs that had been in Vietnam as advisors.
Do we need to go back and...
Oh. We were, the officers in our unit, some of them had just returned from Vietnam as advisors. And if I remember right, I think they had a 13-month tour. One of our good friends, who was Captain James Longerbean, I believe his wife's name was Sheila, and their family arrived, and he had just spent his tour in Vietnam, and he then came to our unit as the captain of one of the companies within the battalion. So we had the beginning of this build-up from Vietnam, and we were aware of that. We trained a lot in those days. We spent about 6 or 7 months of the year out in what we called the field. Most of the time that was done in the winter. After the crops were out in the German fields, the military would move into these areas and conduct maneuvers. And there would be maneuvers with the battalion, with the division, sometimes with the whole 7th Army that was there. We would have an alert at least once a month. Sometimes those were real experiences because of the military. I remember they called one time, and when it was about 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, and they called an alert, and that's not the best time to get the United States Army moving, because they've all been to happy hour for a little bit of time. I think that alert stopped in the motor pool. We didn't move anywhere because we had too many people that weren't in too good shape to move, and I do remember that very well. I remember the first one because I didn't know they were coming, and my sergeant came up and knocked on my door and said, "We're moving out." I thought we were going to war. I had no clue that we just practiced. I had to get all my gear together, and we were assigned a weapon, and away we went. Well, we were gone about 4 or 5 hours and came back, but that was my first experience. Then we really seriously trained in early '65 because that's when the war in Vietnam picked up, and we thought we were going to be shipped out. So we were training very intensely. This was the 3rd Infantry Division, and it was one of the units that was really combat ready, and they were going to send it directly to Vietnam. At that time, George McNamara was Secretary of Defense, and there was a big political turmoil because Europe didn't want any of the units going out because we still had all the Cold War pressures with Russia. So an announcement was made that no units would be sent from Germany, and that gave everybody great relief as far as in the political world. But what happened in reality is that orders were then cut to all of the officers that had not been in high-ranking NCOs and captains and majors and first lieutenants, and they were given orders and to be sent back to the States to form up units that would go to Vietnam. And I remember those were just a terrible time for these families. There would be 48 hours they'd have to pack up all their goods, check their kids or children out of school if they had children, take their automobiles to port, which was Bremerhaven. That's way north of where we are. That was about a day's drive all by itself. And be ready to fly out and come back to the United States. And most of those came to Fort Riley, Kansas. And they formed up the 1st and 9th, I believe it was the 9th Infantry, that ultimately went to Vietnam with those people. So a lot of the people that I knew very well were the first in that first big wave of units going to Vietnam, particularly the aviation unit that I helped take care of. We had an aviation battalion attached to where we were because of our airstrip. And that was mostly fixed-wing observer planes and helicopters, which became important in the Vietnam War, and several of those people did not come back. They were there first in some of the very ugly fighting. I never was involved in the war as such, other than all the stresses of the people that I took care of that had been there or were going there or thought they were going there. And so you could see that carrying over from not only the military people, but the spouses and the children. And that's what you'd see, because there was all this worry of what might happen to them. And that was kind of my exposure to the Vietnam War. Now, at the beginning of this, however, there wasn't much to do in Europe to distinguish yourself from one unit to the other. You know, what can you do? You could shoot a little straighter, or you can get your rocket to shoot a little closer to the target, but there isn't much else for the commander to become known for. The colonel that I worked under was a very, very astute man. And he always would look at what was the big push at the division level as to what we were going to do at the battalion level. For example, one time they decided there was too many POV accidents, which means private operated vehicles, or basically when those of us were on our free time, we were running into things too often. And they were going to have to reduce the number of accidents. The colonel's approach was, as nobody got leave during this testing period. Well, of course, that stopped the accidents. We had a wonderful accident record because nobody could go anywhere. They just stayed there. I thought, what a wonderful move to reduce the accidents, as no one can go. And that was the way he functioned. He was very, very good. But anyway, we were at Wildflecken training. Now, Wildflecken is about 65 or 70, maybe 100 miles. I think it was about 105 to be exact. Miles or kilometers, I've forgotten that. But anyway, a long ways from where we were, and it was up on the Czech border. So that if you go to the backside of Wildflecken, you were then seeing the area where the Russians were. So this was a fairly sensitive area, but we trained there. We went there twice each year. We were up there one time, and I remember I was over at the officers' club, and some of the officers were having a little bit more of the schnapps than they needed. And they began to brag that my company is better than your company, as oftentimes happened, and they decided they were going to walk home. Now, mind you, we were an infantry unit, and they had never walked anywhere, as best I could see, besides the mess hall and to the theater. And we're pushing 100 miles from where we were going, and they decided they're going to walk home. And so the colonel came to me and he said, you need to get your medic unit ready for this walk to take care of us. And I've never been on a long walk. I don't know anything about this. So I went to the manuals, and I'll tell you, at that time there was nothing on how to get ready or prepare for a walk. We talk about walks, but there was nothing written down in the military manuals that they gave me. So I got the unit together, my medical unit, and I said, we got you ready for this. So I had all the aidmen, of course, spread out through the battalions, which is where they were anyway. And then we had a routine. Every hour, I asked the colonel, I said, would you have a 10-minute stop every hour? And what we'll do is we'll check the feet and make sure they're okay, because that's what's really going to cause the trouble. Because they were marching with packs, not much, but enough that they were carrying more than themselves.
And there were how many men in there?
We're now marching about probably 600 or 700.
Wow.
So it was a big enough group with a cross-section from the young people to these older officers. Even the colonel walked. He led the parade, and this man was in his 40s, mid-40s by this time. So he's not an old man, but he's a lot older than the kids. Well, we'd have them pull off their boots every stop. And they all had to carry extra socks tucked in so that if their feet were perspiring, we could change as we went. All these I just put together as deciding these were things we needed. If they blistered, we had sterile needles so we could pop a blister, not to break it open, besides just to get it flat again so it wouldn't cause so much friction. We had moleskin, which we had conjured up somewhere, and benzoin to stick them on for patching it, and we marched that 100 miles in about 5 days. The last night we were just a little bit off the base, and they brought out a new set of fatigues for everybody, and I'll tell you, they marched in with APCs leading them, a tank ahead of that, and the photographers shooting, and the colonel leading the way. Yeah, I'll tell you, it was something to see. And now they were kind of gimping, particularly the colonel. He really, it was hard for him. He was an older man compared to that boy. Only we walked that distance. Well, the unit became famous for walking. And so the next 3 areas that we went out to over the next about a year, we walked back every time. So everybody knew that's what we were going to do.
And you walked off?
Oh, I walked. The first time I walked with them. I walked the first time, and the last time I walked the whole distance. In between two, I rode because I decided I wasn't going to walk. And secondly, I always had to take care of them. So really, when you got to a break, there wasn't a break. Because I had to move up and down the line and take care of those that were having trouble and whatever they might need. So there really wasn't a break. If I was walking, when I'd like to sit down and prop my boots up in the air, why, you'd have to go take care of someone. So I only walked the first and the last one. It was a great experience because we learned a lot about how everybody got along, and they had the food set up for us and took care of us, and that was good. And then I was about ready to leave I was about to leave the service, and then that's when they military commanders really tried hard to talk me into staying, and I really did think about that for a long time. I had not had my residency at that time, and that's when they gave me the Army Commendation Medal. And as I said, I think I was the only physician at that time in that stretch that got one in Europe, but I know all of the area where I was, no one had one. So they gave me a commendation medal. I did bring a copy of that. I didn't bring the whole thing, the original, but I have it here. It's red, and it was as follows. Captain Phillip L. Baker, 055255523, Medical Corps, is cited for meritorious services as battalion surgeon, Headquarters and Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Division, during the period of August of 1964 to June of 1966. Throughout his tour of duty, Captain Baker practiced preventive medicine, making sound and timely recommendations to staff members and commanders on medical matters. His untiring efforts brought a vast improvement in the sanitary conditions of the unit's mess halls. Captain Baker was instrumental in developing the battalion's mass casualty evacuation, standing operation procedures, while also contributing his services to the American Youth Association and high school sports programs during off-duty hours. The outstanding service rendered by Captain Baker reflects great credit upon himself and the Marne Division of the United States Army. And they called my wife and I in and presented that to us just shortly before we were ready to rotate back to the United States. And that was kind of nice because it was really something they didn't have to do. Obviously, I was a 2-year man, and as a reserve officer, and just really didn't have to do it.
That's a
But they
wonderful
did, but
recognition.
I felt good about that.
Absolutely.
The unit was really always very good to me. The only time that I saw a stress in the unit above the other is when they made this rotation in Vietnam. And at one time when they sent all those officers and NCOs out, we had, at the time when I was the third ranking officer in the battalion, and I'm a captain, I was outranked by the chaplain, who was also a captain, of 2 weeks rank on me, and a major that was running the unit for a brief time because we were so short of people, and that lasted for just a brief period when I was there. We rotated home. I was able to come home with my wife. She, by this time, had qualified to be flown home under the Department of Defense teachers side of this. So she was able to fly home, and we shipped home all of our household goods under her, on her ship, so to speak. I wanted to fly home together with her, and I knew I was flying and she was flying, and I was trying to find who assigned the planes in Germany. No one seemed to know. Finally went to Frankfurt in the IG Farben, I believe it is, F-A-R-B-E-N building. It was like our Pentagon, but we had taken over it. Way in the back long hall, I walked into a room one day and I saw a Spec 4 in there, and I told him my story. I'm trying to figure out who can put my wife and I on the same plane. Now by this time I've talked to everybody that I knew, and he said, "You've arrived at the right place, it's done." And sure enough, they cut orders and flew us back to Fort Dix in New Jersey, and then I separated from there in June of 1966. Our car was there already. We had shipped home earlier. We drove all night and the day and arrived in her home in Missouri. And we were there about 2 weeks, there in my home, which was in Iowa, about 150 miles away. And then we started my residency. We moved into Kansas City, Kansas. Again, Betty taught. No, she didn't teach at that time. She worked a job at that time for a period for a few months. I started my residency at the University of Kansas, and I was there from 66 to 1970. And finished my orthopedic program then at the residency. After I finished my residency, I came to Topeka, Kansas, and then joined a group here, and I've been here ever since. We came here in 1970. Our two daughters were born, one in 1968 and one in 1970, shortly after we arrived here, and they grew up. And Nancy, my older daughter, and Betty, my older daughter, grew up here, and she's a PhD candidate student at this time at the University of Kansas and teaches there. My younger daughter, Susan, they're both married, and Susan now is raising her family, but she's an attorney. She graduated from the University of Oklahoma Law School and worked for some time in Lawrence, and then right now is raising the family.
Mm-hmm. Grandkids?
I have 3 grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl, and they're in. Everybody lives in Lawrence, so it's nice for us, for Mom and Dad, so to speak, that we can drive over there and see them easily. At this point in time, I've been an orthopedic surgeon now in Topeka, Kansas for 33 years. I practiced full steam until about 2000, between 2000 and 2001. And then at that time I decided I was just going to practice in the office 4 days a week and do office orthopedics, and that's what I do now. The group that I helped found, and that's the group I'm currently in with Dr. John Lynch, and I performed the first knee replacement, the first hip replacements and the first knee replacements in the state of Kansas. In fact, in the whole Midwest, because Dr. Lynch had a number from the FDA to be able to do this as an experimental operation. So for a year and a half, we did all of them in the state of Kansas. And we had doctors coming from everywhere to learn how to do this, learning from us here in Topeka, and that was an interesting time. And so as a result of that, I've been involved in multi-thousands of those operations during my career. I've been staff president at St. Francis Hospital for 2 years in 1973 to 75, and I've been on the executive committees of both hospitals off and on through my career. My hobbies include genealogy now that I have more time, and so I've spent a fair amount of time putting together family histories, and I just have the first book that I've written. It's on one part of my wife's family, and I this past week, really just here this last week in September of 2003, picked up the first copy of that as it came off the press, as we're getting ready to have it bound and put into a real book form. But I'm now home editing the first copy. It's about 325 pages of family history. And that's where we are. I brought along this morning a couple things that just that came from that I brought with me. The 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry, which I knew nothing about when I arrived. I'm not wasn't a military family or anything like this. I grew up in a farm in Iowa. The 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry goes back, I believe it opened with the War of 1812.
Wow.
So it's an old unit, and it's one of those they've kept around for a long, long time. And I think the things people might know of it, it was in China for about 25, 26 years during the war there, and that's where it got its name of what it's known. It's known as the Can-Do Battalion, and that was given to it, my understanding, when they were in China, that they can do. Recently I was watching, as we were starting up our war preparations for the invasion in Iraq, I was watching TV one night, and they were doing some interviews with units before the war started, and they had this group of people, and I didn't pay much attention to what their insignias were at the time, but at the end, they all yelled to the camera, "Can do," and I said, I knew then right away. I paid attention because this had to be the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry. During the Second World War, it was famous in the sense that Audie Murphy was in this unit when all these things that he did came from this unit. So it's been in a lot of difficult times, and it was one of the units that was sent to Iraq, the 3rd Infantry Division. It's over there now. And so I brought that along. And the same thing, the other thing they did is, since I was in Germany, of course, everything in Germany kind of focuses, that's not quite right. A lot of things in Germany focus around drinking beer. They had made up a Stein, which has a APC carrier on the top, and it has the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry, and then for everybody that wanted to get one, they then wrote your name, which says Captain Phillip Baker, Surgeon. And on the side, it tells about the officers on one side, and on the other side, it lists the campaigns. They list here from 1798 that it actually formed. The little booklet that they put out, actually says 1812, but it's a long, I don't know if it's the oldest unit, but it's one of the very, very old units in the military. And this was the top in those days. That was to represent what we called APCs, or armored personnel carriers. This is what they looked like in the mid-60s. Now they have a different look, but this was a armored vehicle that would carry troops. It was not a weapon, or didn't. They could shoot a machine gun out of it, but basically it was just to transport soldiers safely. I had one like this when I went out, and that's what we made an aid station out of it, except on the back end of it, it had a top that went up in the airways, and then we could put a tent out from behind, and we'd set the aid station behind this up on a tent. And that's where we would have sick call when we would be out, or if we were in a war. That's where we would do the fighting. But it was a unit like this, except it was just made a little different on the back. And my aid station worked out of that.
Well, you have had a very, very interesting life and done a lot of service, not only during the time that you were in the military, but your whole life has been a life of service to people. And it has really been a privilege and an honor having a chance to listen to you tell us about your life today, Dr. Baker. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.